We moved in together, but she wasn't comfortable. We had been dating for nearly 2 years when we made the decision to move in together. It felt like the next natural step in our relationship. The idea of merging our lives seemed right. We had spent countless weekends together, sharing laughter, meals, and the occasional quiet evening on the couch. There was a sense of ease between us, a rhythm we had found that felt like home. At least, I thought it did. The first few days were filled with the excitement of new beginnings, boxes stacked in the living room, our things scattered about, trying to find a new space in this shared apartment. It was small, cozy, and yet everything we had dreamed of, just the two of us, together in a space we could call our own. She was a quiet person by nature, someone who tended to keep to herself and only shared what she was comfortable with. I had always admired her independence and the way she held herself, secure in her own world, but as the days turned into weeks, I started to notice something. She seemed more withdrawn, quieter than usual, and there was a subtle tension in her demeanor that hadn't been there before. It was hard to pinpoint at first. The early mornings, when I'd wake up to find her already dressed and sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, felt different now. She would smile, but there was something missing behind it. The late nights we spent together, when we used to talk about our dreams, our future, had started to feel strained. She was there physically, but emotionally, it was like there was a wall between us, something intangible that kept me from reaching her. As the days passed, I tried to brush it off, assuming it was just an adjustment phase. Moving in together is a big step, after all. There were bound to be moments of discomfort, of needing time to get used to someone else's habits, their space, the little quirks that make them who they are. I told myself it would pass, that we would both fall into a rhythm soon enough, but it didn't pass. It only grew more noticeable, like a crack in the foundation that widened with every passing day. I could sense her reluctance, even in the simplest of things. She would hesitate when asked to join me for dinner or for a walk, as though the invitation itself made her uneasy. The space that had once felt like it was ours started to feel like hers, a place she inhabited more than shared. I began to feel like an intruder in my own home. Every time I would enter a room, she would be lost in thought, staring out the window, or looking down at her phone, and the silence between us would stretch. It was a silence that wasn't comfortable, but suffocating. There were signs of discomfort in the way she interacted with the space itself. I noticed that she would often retreat to the bedroom, staying there for long periods. The bedroom, once a place of warmth and shared moments, had become her sanctuary, a place where I was no longer welcome in the same way. She kept to herself there, organizing her things in meticulous order, as if trying to keep a sense of control over one small part of the world that was hers alone. It wasn't that I was intentionally encroaching on her space, it was just that I hadn't known how to navigate this new dynamic. It was a shift I hadn't been prepared for. The more I tried to engage with her, the more she pulled away. I would cook dinner, hoping to create a sense of normalcy, but she would often sit silently at the table, picking at her food without saying much. Her responses were short, distant. I could feel the gap growing between us, but I didn't know how to bridge it. Every attempt to talk to her about how I was feeling was met with silence. She didn't seem angry, just distant and comfortable, as though something about being with me, in the same space, was suddenly too much for her. It became clear that she wasn't just adjusting to living together, she was withdrawing from me. The emotional distance had turned physical. She would sleep at the far edge of the bed, keeping as much space between us as possible, as though she feared being too close. I had always known her to be reserved, but this was different. This was a distance I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just about needing space in a literal sense, it was about the emotional space she seemed to need from me. I tried to be patient, to give her time, but it was becoming more difficult to ignore the deepening divide between us. Our conversations, once filled with laughter and shared stories, had become routine, almost mechanical. I would talk about my day, and she would listen, but there was no depth to her responses. She no longer seemed to care about the small details that had once made our relationship feel intimate and alive. The affection we once shared, the little touches and gestures, had faded. I found myself longing for the closeness we used to have, but it felt like a distant memory, slipping through my fingers. I began to question whether I was doing something wrong. Maybe I had rushed into this. Maybe I had pushed her into something she wasn't ready for. She had never been the type to voice her concerns, always choosing to silently bear whatever discomfort she felt. But living together was different. It was a constant, daily reality that couldn't be ignored. The more I tried to bridge the gap, the more she seemed to retreat into herself. One evening, after a particularly quiet dinner, I sat down on the couch, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. She was in the bedroom, as usual, with the door slightly ajar. I could hear the soft rustle of her moving around, but she didn't come out. My heart sank as I realized the truth. She wasn't just uncomfortable with the space, she was uncomfortable with me. The thought stung in a way I couldn't fully articulate. It wasn't just about the apartment, or the logistics of living together. It was about us, our relationship, and the growing uncertainty that we were drifting apart. I had envisioned us becoming stronger through this, but instead, it felt like we were unraveling. The next few days passed in a blur of unspoken tension. I could feel her discomfort radiating in every interaction, and I was at a loss for how to fix it. The truth was, I wasn't sure if it could be fixed. We had moved in together, believing it would bring us closer, but in reality, it had exposed the cracks that had always existed between us. Wasn't the person she needed me to be, and she wasn't the person I thought she was. We had reached a point where the comfortable familiarity we had shared was no longer enough to bridge the divide that had formed. The decision didn't come suddenly. It wasn't a dramatic confrontation or a big argument. It was more of a quiet realization, a moment of clarity that settled deep within me. We were no longer in sync, and the space that we had once shared with ease now felt foreign. We had tried to force something that wasn't meant to be. The comfort I had imagined in our shared life together had never materialized. She wasn't comfortable, and neither was I, and in that discomfort, I realized that perhaps moving in together had been the mistake. We hadn't broken up yet, but I could see the end on the horizon, a slow, inevitable pull away from each other. The apartment that was supposed to be our home was now just a place we inhabited separately. The dream I had built of us growing closer, of building a life together, was crumbling, piece by piece, as she continued to retreat into herself. I began to wonder if we were ever meant to live together, or if we had just been trying to force something that was always going to feel forced. The love was still there, but it wasn't enough. And as I stood at the edge of this painful realization, I knew that we would have to find a way to separate, to reclaim our lives, to heal, and to search for the peace that we had lost somewhere along the way. In the end, it wasn't about one person being at fault. It was about two people who had simply outgrown each other in ways neither had anticipated. We had moved in together, believing it would bring us closer, but it had only shown us how far apart we truly were. And so, we would have to move on, each of us finding our own way in a world that no longer included the other. The dream had died quietly, but the lesson remained. Sometimes, no matter how much we want it, living together isn't always the answer. The days following the realization were heavy with unspoken words and unacknowledged tension. The apartment, once filled with the anticipation of new beginnings, now felt like a cold, empty space between us. I watched as she moved around the apartment with a quiet grace, still avoiding eye contact, still retreating into herself more with each passing day. It was as if we were both stuck in a delicate dance of avoidance, each afraid to confront the growing distance that neither of us knew how to bridge. She spent more time in the bedroom, leaving me to occupy the living room. The silence between us became more oppressive, each of us caught in our own world, each of us unsure of how to move forward without acknowledging the elephant in the room. I had tried to reach out, tried to talk to her in ways that felt natural, but the words never came. She would offer nothing more than a slight nod or a quick glance, as though anything deeper was simply too much for her to process. I found myself wondering what had gone wrong. I had never pushed her into moving in with me. It had been her idea too, and yet here we were, strangers in a space we had once imagined as a home. It felt like we were both waiting for the other to make the first move, but neither of us was willing to take the leap. I couldn't bring myself to be the one to ask her outright what was going on, not when I already had a sense that the answer might break what little remained of the bond between us. I began to retreat into my own mind. I spent more hours at work, using it as an escape from the increasingly uncomfortable atmosphere at home. I would come back late at night, after she had already gone to bed, and I would sit in the dim light of the living room, pondering what had happened. Had we simply moved too fast? Was it that she wasn't ready to live together? Or was it that we had fundamentally misunderstood what we needed from each other? The more I reflected, the more I realized how much I had ignored the subtle signs of her discomfort before. She had always been independent, a little distant, but I had mistaken her space for strength. I had never really asked her what living together would mean for her, how it would affect her. I had assumed that the love we shared was enough to overcome the growing pains of merging lives. But love wasn't enough, not without communication, not without understanding the depth of each other's needs. One morning, after a particularly long night of sleepless tossing and turning, I woke up to find her standing by the window, her back to me, looking out at the city below. The light from the early morning sun filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on her face, and for the first time in weeks, I felt the weight of her presence again, silent, but tangible. I watched her for a moment, unsure of what to do, whether I should approach her or retreat back to the safety of the other room, but something shifted. Inside me, I couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, not when it was clear that neither of us was okay. I had to face the reality that moving in together had been a mistake, but the question remained, where did we go from here? I couldn't keep living in this quiet limbo, and neither could she. The distance between us had become too vast to ignore, and yet neither of us had the courage to bridge the gap. She was standing there for what felt like hours, and moving, her shoulders tense as though she were holding herself back from something. Finally, she turned, and I could see it in her eyes, the exhaustion, the uncertainty, the confusion. She didn't say anything, but I could feel it. The wall that had once been so impenetrable between us was now beginning to crack. In that moment, I realized that I had spent so much time trying to hold things together that I had never truly listened to her, never asked her what she needed. I had assumed that because we loved each other, that would be enough, but love is not just about being together. It's about being present for each other, understanding the things that make us feel safe, heard, and valued. And in all my efforts to make her comfortable, I had neglected the very foundation that a relationship is built upon: communication. I stepped closer to her, carefully, as though not wanting to startle her. She didn't pull away, but she didn't lean in either. It was as if she were waiting for me to say something, to offer her the reassurance that she was looking for. We had created this space together, but somehow, we had lost ourselves in it. In trying to make a home, we had overlooked the fact that a home isn't just about the walls or the furniture, it's about the people inside, how they feel, how they belong. As the days turned into weeks, we both tried in our own ways to make things work. I focused more on my emotional awareness, paying closer attention to her body language, to the small things that might indicate how she was truly feeling. But it wasn't enough. The dynamic between us had shifted irreparably. There was a comfort that we had once shared, a sense of closeness that had been lost in the process of living together. She wasn't just uncomfortable with the apartment. She was uncomfortable with the changes in herself and in the relationship that living together had brought to light. She was questioning not just her space but her identity within this partnership. And I was too. Eventually, we reached a silent agreement: we had to separate. We didn't say the words aloud, not at first, but we both knew it was coming. The space we had once shared as a home had become a place of retreat, a place where we felt more alone than together. We could no longer ignore the fact that, despite our love for each other, we had become strangers under the same roof. The process of untangling our lives was difficult. It wasn't an overnight decision. There was no dramatic confrontation, no final argument. It was simply the realization that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the complexities of two people learning how to live together. Our individual needs, our emotional worlds, had drifted too far apart. We moved out, each of us taking the space we had once shared, carefully packing our lives back into the boxes that had once symbolized the beginning of something beautiful. It wasn't easy. There were moments of regret, of questioning if we had made the right choice, but in the end, we both knew that staying together would only deepen the disconnect. It wasn't about love anymore, it was about what was best for both of us. We parted ways with quiet understanding, each of us retreating back into the lives we had before. And while there was a sense of relief in the separation, there was also sadness. We had loved each other deeply. But sometimes, love isn't enough to erase the space that grows between two people when they can't find the balance of living together. The days after the decision were a blur, a mixture of sadness, relief, and an overwhelming sense of failure. Despite all the emotional distance that had been building between us, it still felt like a crushing blow to finally face the truth that we couldn't make it work. We had tried to hold on for so long, convinced that the love we had shared was enough to overcome any obstacles, including the growing discomfort that had begun to define our lives together. But now, seemed like our love had turned into something unrecognizable, suffocated by the expectations and pressures of living together. The packing process was painful. There was no animosity, no loud words exchanged, but the silence between us was deafening. We each took our things in turns, silently removing the pieces of our lives from the apartment that had once been our shared sanctuary. My things, my books, my clothes, my small possessions seemed to fit neatly into boxes, but it was the memories that refused to be packed away. I lingered in the living room for a moment longer than I should have, my hands running over the edge of the couch where we had spent so many nights watching TV, laughing, or simply being together. The place had once felt alive with possibility, but now, it was just an empty shell. I could still see the faint imprint of her, the way she used to sit there, curled up with a blanket, lost in a book. That image felt so distant now, as if it had never really been. As I folded my clothes and packed them into boxes, I couldn't help but notice the small things she had left behind: her favorite mug in the kitchen, her scarf draped over the back of a chair. There was a part of me that wanted to keep them, to hold on to whatever fragments of her I could find. But I knew that it wasn't about the things. It was about the connection, the bond that had unraveled before my eyes. She didn't say much, just a few quiet comments here and there, but I could feel her watching me as I packed up the final bits of my life in that apartment. Her eyes were distant, glazed over, as if she were trying to disconnect emotionally from the reality of what we were both facing. And yet, there was something in the way she moved, something almost resigned. It was like she had already accepted that this was the end, that this was the only way forward. I could sense it in the air, a heaviness that was impossible to ignore. It was the weight of unspoken words, of things we hadn't fully addressed but both knew all too well. As the last few items were loaded into the car, I glanced at her one final time. There was no final goodbye, no emotional outpouring of grief or regret. Just a quiet acknowledgement of the end of something we had both fought for, and with that, I left. The door closed behind me, and I drove away from the life we had built together, the life that had once seemed so full of promise. In the weeks that followed, everything felt unfamiliar. It wasn't just the emptiness of the apartment I had left behind, but the overwhelming sense of disorientation in my own heart. There was an ache, a constant dull throb of regret that followed me wherever I went. I missed her presence, the little things that had made our time together feel special. The way she laughed when I told bad jokes, the way she would hum when she was lost in thought, the way her hair always fell just so, like she didn't even try. I missed it all, but I also knew that the space between us had grown too wide, too deep to ever cross again. I moved into a smaller apartment, a place that felt too quiet and too empty to be home. The silence was overwhelming. I would sit on the couch at night, just like I had in the old place, but now there was no one beside me. No one to talk to, no one to share the moments with. I didn't know if it was the loneliness or the sadness that hurt more, but everything felt like it was suffocating me. I would replay the good times in my mind when we were happy, when everything felt easy, and I would wonder where it all went wrong. I tried to occupy my mind, but it was impossible to escape the memories. It was the small things that hurt the most. Her favorite song would come on the radio, and I would feel a pang of longing. A couple of friends mentioned her in passing, and I would smile and nod, but the truth was, it felt like a betrayal to even talk about her anymore. Our shared memories had become a tangled mess of what we once were, and I couldn't bring myself to unravel them. It was too painful. At the same time, I could feel myself starting to change. I wasn't the same person I had been when I first moved in with her. I was becoming someone I didn't recognize, someone who was uncertain of the future and afraid of what might come next. The loneliness crept in slowly, a quiet companion, but it was always there, lurking. I wondered if she felt it too, but I didn't have the courage to reach out to her. It had been a mutual decision to separate, and it seemed wrong to go back now, to try to reopen a door that had already closed. Days turned into weeks, and the reality of being alone settled in. I found myself constantly thinking about her, wondering if she felt the same emptiness that I did, wondering if she regretted it. Sometimes I would think I saw her on the street, a fleeting glimpse of someone with the same hair or the same walk, and my heart would race with hope. But then, I would remind myself that we were no longer part of each other's worlds. We had made our choices, and now we had to live with them. But the worst part was the doubt. Did we make the right decision? Had we given up too soon? Could things have worked if we had tried harder? These questions haunted me. I replayed the moments in my mind, the small signs I had ignored, the moments I had pushed aside, thinking they would resolve themselves. Could we have worked through it? Could we have found a way back to each other? The uncertainty gnawed at me, a relentless ache. In a way, our breakup was a slow burn, a gradual process that neither of us fully acknowledged until it was too late. There had been no grand moment of realization, no dramatic outburst, just a slow and steady erosion of the connection we once shared. And now, as I sat in my empty apartment, I couldn't shake the feeling that everything had been quietly slipping through my fingers for months. Time went on, and the pain of separation slowly began to dull, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. I would wake up in the middle of the night, startled by the silence, and for a brief moment, I would think I could still hear her breathing beside me. I would look over at the empty space in bed and feel the weight of it all, the loss, the regret, and the knowledge that I could never go back to the way things were. As much as I tried to move forward, to build a new life and fill the silence with new experiences, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had lost something irreparable. The person I had been before we moved in together seemed like a distant memory, a shadow of who I had become. And no matter how hard I tried to let go, the echo of that shared life continued to haunt me, reminding me of everything I had lost. In the end, the breakup wasn't just about the apartment or the space we shared, it was about the unraveling of a dream. We had imagined a future together, but in the end, that dream had faded into the past, leaving only the remains of what might have been.